This is Margaret McMullan, who I consider a good friend, but to do her justice, I'm going to read her introduction to make sure I leave nothing out. Margaret is the author of 9 award-winning books, including 3 acclaimed young adult novels. She received an NEA fellowship and a Fulbright professorship in Hungary, where she researched her most recent book, her memoir, Where the Angels Lived. It's exceptional. She previously served as the Melvin Peterson Endowed Chair in Literature and Creative Writing at the University of Evansville, where she taught for 25 years. I think she moved in junior high or something when she started, as well as teaching at several other MFA programs. She now lives and writes full-time in Pass Christian, Mississippi, and she will introduce our guest. Thank you so much, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Peyton. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so I told Erik I've got a clipboard, okay? So I'm telling you all, I've got a clipboard, and I'm going to properly introduce you first. And I know you all know who he is, but I want to make sure you know the details. Erik Larson is the best-selling author of 9 books. His latest, The Demon of Unrest, and this is how well I read it, is a nonfiction thriller about the 5 months between Lincoln's election and the start of the Civil War. It is incredibly beautifully written. 6 of his books became New York Times bestsellers. 2 of these, The Splendid and the Vile, Dead Wake, hit #1 immediately after they launched. I'm telling you this. Yep. His chronicle of the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, The Devil in the White City, was a finalist for the National Book Award. I think we have some serial killer fans in our audience today. And, well, that just won all kinds of awards. In the Garden of Beasts, about how America's first ambassador to Nazi Germany and his daughter, why is that getting an applaud? And his daughter experiencing the rising terror of Hitler's rule is currently in development with Studio Canal and Playtone. Who's going to play the daughter? Oh my gosh, what a piece of work that. At the University of Evansville, I know I'm going back a little, but I think it's really interesting. Erik studied Russian history, language, and culture. He received a master's in journalism from Columbia University. He wrote for the Bucks County Courier-Times, Wall Street Journal, and later became a contributing writer for Time magazine. His magazine stories have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, and others. And I wonder, too, I don't know if we want to approach this now, but I think of you learning your research skills, that skill set, from that young age that you were. Okay. I could go on, but I'm going to run out of time. Please visit his website because it is just delightful. Read his hilarious alternative bio, and yes, there is one, and learn about some of his more personal exploits, like why he studied Russian, there was a girl, and learn to drink vodka from a real Russian prince. We're so thrilled and honored and delighted to welcome you back to Mississippi.
Back.
Yes?
Actually, I've been here a number of times, actually.
So the first one thing I don't want to forget saying is Erik was our guest, our first guest for our author community read in Pass Christian. It's called One Book, One Pass. And my husband, Pat O'Connor, who's sitting there, we started this program with the library so that everyone in Pass Christian could read just one book, and we'd bring in a living, that is very important, a living author to Pass Christian to come and talk about that book. And the book was Dead Wake. And it was our first one, and you agreed to come. And it was his first time on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. We're sitting out on the porch the final day that you were there. We're looking out over at Ship Island. In my mind, that's what inspired. Because I was just waxing poetic about, well, there's Ship Island and blah-de-blah-de-blah.
Well, you're wrong.
I knew I was.
Yeah.
So, welcome.
Thank you.
We're going to have about 15 minutes. Erik loves questions from the audience.
But you can truly ask me absolutely anything, but
Anything.
there is one question that you can't ask, but I'm not going to tell you what that is.
So we'll leave questions. So think of questions, and there's going to be a signing after this as well. Are you okay with that?
Absolutely.
All right, good. I'm going to set the scene for Demon of Unrest. It's 5 months before the Civil War, 1860. I feel like I'm telling you. Here's what's going to happen. I won't give away the end. Oh, wait, we're in the South. Abraham Lincoln just won a tight race for president. There's a great deal of concern for the electoral count. The actions of a particular Supreme Court justice are in question. There are secret threats on the president's life. The country is bitterly divided. You've got extremists who want to destroy the Union, maybe by seceding.
We are talking about the Civil War. Sorry.
I don't know, are we?
I promise not to talk. I'm not going to talk politics. I made a vow at the start of the year, my New Year's resolution, never to talk politics with anyone over the age of 5.
And yet, your focus is on this lonely outpost in Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter. So I'm now turning the page of my clipboard.
The problem with a clipboard is
So can you talk about the premise of this book and why you wanted to write this?
well, what's important. Well, to me, what is astonishing about this book is that, and you can Google this, is that for years I went on record at public events saying that I would never write a book about the Civil War. And I would never write about Abraham Lincoln. And here I am with a book about the Civil War where Abraham Lincoln is a key character. And how that came about has a lot to do with the pandemic. I was on a book tour for my book, The Splendid and the Vile. I was halfway through the tour when the country locked down, and I was on my way home on a plane. It happened to be my wife's birthday also. So I come back to the United States, come back to Long Island. That was our pandemic fortress. We were going to hide out there for the duration, and I had a lot of extra time on my hands that I had not anticipated. So I started looking for my next project. I had a bunch of ideas that I was aimlessly exploring, and if you recall, at that time, as now unfortunately, there was a good deal of political unrest with people muttering about contemporary Civil War, or contemporary secession. Texas. We're talking about you, Texas. And I started thinking, I don't know how the Civil War actually started. I mean, really, I'm a Civil War neophyte, and so I thought maybe that would be something worth looking into. So, in addition to these other ideas, I started doing some research. My usual MO would be to jump into a physical archive and just start looking around with no advance warning to the archivist, nothing. Just go in and see what kind of records there were. Couldn't do it because of the pandemic. So I started doing stuff online. I don't like doing online research. I find it stultifying. But I did come across this record, the collection of records called The War of the Rebellion, a compilation of the records of the Union and Confederate armies.
Can you say that again real slowly so we can get that, so people can write that title down?
The War of the Rebellion, a compilation of official records of the Union and Confederate armies. And I started reading this thing online initially, and I found it really compelling. It read sort of like a thriller. It's like, this is a collection of documents, hundreds of documents, scrupulously curated in chronological order. Letter, response, telegram, response, report, response, all this great stuff. So I managed to find a publisher, that there was a publisher who did physical versions, physical volumes of this record set. I ordered volume 1. It arrived at our place on Long Island. I disinfected it. I really did. That's what we did back then. And I started reading again and just went through this whole book about the start of the Civil War and thought, this is great stuff. And that's what got me started on the story. I was still not completely committed to the idea until the events of January 6, 2021. I was sitting in my office watching this whole thing unfold, and I started thinking, this must be what people felt back in the day. This is a sense of what I was feeling was sort of anxiety, this fear, anger, and also sort of a sense of suspense, what was going to happen. And that's when I realized this is not a story from the past. This is a very contemporary story, and is worth telling once more albeit in a different fashion. So that's how the whole thing came about.
So how
was there a day that I regretted working on this book about the Civil War? Yes, every single day in the course of writing the first draft.
How far into it were you before January 6 events unfolded?
Well, I had done a lot of preliminary research. We're basically talking about a year from when the nation locked down to when January 6 happened. But I was spacing it with other ideas. I'd work on something for a couple of weeks, and then I'd go back to this and work on that for a couple. So long enough to really have a good sense of the players, the characters. I decided fairly early on about a couple of characters who are my primary villains. I love my villains in this book. And by the way, you said that everybody knows the ending, and yes, we know how the war turned out and so forth. But the ending of this book, I'm particularly happy with. So
you are particularly.
I am very happy with it.
So we can't talk. Do we talk?
No, you can't talk about it. No.
Oh, I was gonna.
No.
Oh. Gosh.
Down. No.
It is really clever, in a beautiful, in the terrible, beautiful way.
Oh.
And I do want to talk about, because I don't think people speak enough about your prose, and without getting too nitpicky, one of the things that I've heard you talk about, in the COVID years, you were basically locked down with this particular book, these volumes, so you could do your research, the beginning research. Right. But then you got out.
And other records, other online records as well.
Right.
But then after COVID began to let up, archives were closed. You couldn't go to archives if you wanted to. And even if they were open, you wouldn't want to travel to them. So finally, when things started to open up, actually kind of a couple of years later, I couldn't even get out to Fort Sumter for a couple of years. But when things finally opened up, I was able to go to the Library of Congress, Madison Reading Room, Charleston, to the Charleston Historical Society, and so forth. And then, I realized in a very clear way that, this was really a compelling story for me to be looking into.
What's the thing that clicks with you? You've talked about the importance of seeing like a calling card or holding a lock of hair, and then all of a sudden that character becomes completely real to you.
Yeah. Well, it can be anything. It's a different thing, obviously, for all of my books. But one of the things that really made this story come home to me was when I was in Charleston, going sort of deep into the records of like the Bank of Charleston and so forth, because you really need to understand. I had a very superficial understanding of the dynamics and the finances of slavery. And when I came across these documents in the Charleston Historical Society, there were one set was mortgages on land and property secured by the bodies of enslaved blacks. This is how ingrained slavery was in the capital structure of the South, and this was really revelatory to me. But the thing I look for most when I'm looking into an idea is this notion of real-life historical suspense. And that always starts at the very beginning of the conception of an idea. The idea itself has to have some fundamental element of some organic narrative power. And there's nothing more powerful than the start of America's gravest tragedy. So that's why this was in some ways a natural. The question was, question was, this is obviously people have written about the Civil War. Surprise, surprise. There were apparently. I asked Siri one morning. I asked her how many. I often talk to Siri at odd moments, but I asked her how many books have been written about the Civil War, and the reply was 60,000. 60,000. And I'm thinking to myself, what the hell? Sorry. What the heck am I doing writing about something that's been written about so much before? But then what I often feel is, it's all in the telling. How you tell a story can make it very different, very, very fresh. And so that's what helped me also to move forward. But this was one of those. Actually, I can't say this is one of those. I mean, I always second guess myself. I like to think actually second guessing is my superpower. I'm a big believer in what Jimmy Buffett said in one of his songs: indecision may or may not be my problem. And so I'm constantly, I like to think that the doubt is a very powerful, I'm being half facetious. Doubt is a very powerful tool for me because it makes me look deeper into things to convince myself that this thing really happened. And sometimes, it may sound ridiculous, but you can know that a thing happened, but until you see the records of, enslaved people serving as security for a mortgage, until you come across flyers for, like as I did, for in one case the sale of 153 enslaved blacks, including with all of these people who were being sold had names, and on this list were toddlers, age 2, age 4, and at least 3 who were identified only as infant. And when you read that, you're like, wow, I didn't really grasp the magnitude of this in the way that, the tactile way that suddenly I did.
So I'm going to go back to that moment then, and you're feeling your feelings. Are you writing what you're feeling down? I don't mean to be precious about this, but
No. No.
You're realizing.
I just know that this was a powerful thing, and that it's very important for me to take note that this moved me in a powerful way,
right.
and helped me down the road for getting rid of that final element of doubt. Now, I say it helped me get rid of that final element of doubt, but in the case of this book, my wife would confirm this if she had come down with me. About 2 weeks before I turned in my first draft, and I actually never think of things as first drafts. I always think this draft, whatever you want to call it, I wouldn't mind seeing in print the next day. But in this case, I told my wife, I said, you know what, and this is as the entire book is laid out in our New York apartment, all over, from room to room to room to room, like 800 pages. I told myself, my wife, I said, you know what, I'm gonna kill it. I'm gonna kill it. No, she looked at me. She's heard this before. She gave me that look that all of us men have seen before. And sure enough, the next day I was committed and back on the trail.
I did not know you did that with the pages.
Oh yeah.
So
That's something that I have always done, even in journalism. But what I really honed that device was when I was working on Devil in the White City, which, as those of you who read it know, is a dual narrative. And making the two stories work together side by side so that everything tracked chronologically and so forth. There too, I had that entire book laid out in my Seattle bedroom. My wife loved that phase. And laid out entirely in my Seattle bedroom. I'll never forget one day, I'm in there, I'm on my knees, moving things back and forth between the narratives and to keep the chronology going. And they had the doors open to a little balcony we had. It was a lovely spring day. And in walks my dog, Molly, my late dog, Molly. Molly walks in, pauses briefly at the door, enters the room over this manuscript of mine, goes over to the balcony, gets her ball, returns over the balcony, you know, and it just really gave me perspective, you know, so.
And I feel compelled to shout out to Eudora Welty, who also had that same practice, but she put it on her stories, not on her dining room table and pinned it together. You know that.
It's a good technique.
It is wonderful, and especially in an era when we're used to cutting and pasting on the screen, and you don't prefer reading on the screen.
You can't edit a large project on a computer screen. I firmly believe you just can't do it. I don't care how good your software is. It's not doable. I have to physically cut things to shreds. First, chapter by chapter, move things around, then cut chapters into pieces, and then finally, literally, I get down to the granular level, and I'm cutting paragraphs into pieces and moving things around.
You know, and I think of you as a structuralist. I don't know if that's a word.
It is now. Works for me.
And we're in the sanctuary, so I've heard you talk about the train ride of Abraham Lincoln,
Right.
as a kind of structure that you saw immediately, like, you know, because I have not read about this train ride, so this was to me a big aha moment while I was reading this book, and that was a structure for you, you know.
Well, what I like to look for when I'm working on a book, I call them runs. And that's any passage, any material that contains motion, that puts a story in motion. And what Margaret is referring to is Lincoln, after he was elected. Well, let's just walk very quickly through that portion of the saga. Lincoln gets elected November 6, 1860. He is enough of a jurist, he was a lawyer, enough of a jurist and respecter of the Constitution and so forth to recognize that he is not really the president yet. First has to come the electoral count and then the inauguration. And interestingly, to me, during this period, during this very much lame duck period, March 4th was the inauguration. He decides that he's not gonna speak out on the national crisis because he doesn't want to throw fuel on this fire until he's actually president. Now, there are consequences to that, and we can talk about that too if you like. But comes the inauguration. He decides to set out before the inauguration by train from Springfield, Illinois, to show Americans, those who voted for him, this is mostly a northern tour, but it did go through finally one slave state, Maryland. He wanted to literally show Americans what this guy looked like, who they elected. Because you remember, there were no photographs yet. There were daguerreotypes, there were block carvings and so forth printed in newspapers, but nobody really understood who this guy was. And so there's this wonderful train ride that sets out from Springfield, Illinois. It's a very sad departure. First he has a yard sale. This was one of my favorite details. This is one of the little things that I die for when I'm doing a book. There's a receipt for purchases by a guy who went to this yard sale that Lincoln and his wife Mary threw in the days before this journey began, so that they can actually help pay for the journey. And I was just thrilled to see that. You'll see the entire receipt in the book. So he sets out on this train journey to tell people show people what he's all about. He doesn't, except on a couple of occasions, he doesn't get into the whole national debate, the whole thing about secession and so forth. He just literally says to people at each train stop, I wanted you to see my beautiful countenance. There I am. Have a good day. Goodbye. And he did use those terms. I want you to see my beautiful countenance, and this train journey was just so charismatic, so wonderful, so full of strange and lovely details, but also threat, because as it advanced, it became clear, well, to certain people, it became clear that there was grave risk to Lincoln on this train ride, especially at the point where he was going to be going through Baltimore, which was a hotbed of secession, and where he would have to leave, his train car would have to leave one line and be taken to another line. Ordinarily, that would be a wonderful opportunity for a big celebratory parade, Lincoln in Baltimore marching from one train track to the next train track. Not in Baltimore. It was a point of real grave concern. And so the belief was, Lincoln himself came to believe that maybe he really was at risk. Changed his plan, changed his train trip so that he, instead of coming triumphantly into Washington, he arrives pre-dawn, 4 a.m., in disguise, to the nation's capital where he is going to be the President of the United States. And man, people made hay. You talk about the press making fun of people today, candidates who do this, that, or the other thing. We won't even talk about eating pets, but sorry,
I almost missed that. Get that reference.
So, but, well, I was joking with my wife that it gives new meaning to hush puppies, but sorry. So, but there was this threat believed to be a credible threat. Now, since then, there are historians and there's questions that have been raised. Well, how was he really facing an assassination threat? But that was just a wonderful part of the story. I mean, he comes to Washington under this dark potential that he could be killed, because at this talk about the influence of January 6th on this book, in 1860-61 actually, the two moments of gravest national concern before the start of the Civil War were, would the electoral count come off, and would the inauguration come off? Doesn't that sound familiar? Now, at the time, though, the nation handled it very differently. America's commanding general was Winfield Scott, very interesting character. He's about 6'4", 350 pounds, aging out of his job, suffered every conceivable ailment that somebody of that age in that era could have, spent the day with his feet in an ice bath, but he was inalterably loyal to the concept of America as a union of states. And he vowed, by God, this electoral count is going to come off. He flooded Washington with troops, cavalry, cannon. He vowed, he said, if anybody tries to disrupt this electoral count, I'm going to strap him to the front of a 12-pound cannon and manure the hills of Arlington, Virginia with his body. The electoral count came off without a hitch. So anyway, I veered wildly off a path there. I veered wildly off.
Okay. What do you think surprised? I know that you've talked about how you were surprised and delighted by Abraham Lincoln's sense of humor.
Yeah.
Especially during those train.
Well, I should talk about Abraham Lincoln. I mean, I probably shouldn't confess that I'm sufficiently arrogant to say to you that, I did not share the whole hagiography of Lincoln. He was not to me an idol that I'd always had. I approached him with the idea, okay, prove it. Prove to me, I started out just using original documents to try to get my own sense of Abraham Lincoln. And sure enough, I fell for the guy. And the things that made me fall for him were his sense of humor. He's a very funny guy. He loved his own jokes, and he had this high, reedy laugh. I know it doesn't sound like your perception of Lincoln, and even when he spoke, he had this sort of reedy voice. But he loved his own jokes. He loved to tell his own stories. And the thing that really endeared him to me was he couldn't spell. He could not spell inauguration. Never could spell inauguration. He did not know how to spell Sumter. It does not have a P. It's just Sumter, S-U-M-T-E-R. And I was just like, okay, you win. You're in the book. You're great. I loved it. So, and there's one story along the train ride. He starts to tell a story in one town, and he's halfway through the story. It's one of his funny stories. He's halfway through the story, and the train starts moving. And everybody laughs and the train goes off in the distance. At the next stop, he tells this, he stops, and there are all these people running up along the tracks. And the joke is that they were all running from the previous town to hear the rest of this story, which is not true. Not true because it was like 10 miles, right? But everybody got a good kick out of it. He tells the story, and on goes the whole saga. But he had a very good sense of humor, very, very warm.
And you were delighted and surprised by Lincoln's sense of humor. Do you think that there was something about the South that surprised Lincoln?
Well, so the problem, one of the problems, one element of the fuel that fed the Civil War was that Lincoln had only a limited comprehension of how much slavery mattered to the South and how terrified Southerners were that his real agenda might be to abolish slavery. Now, he had said, and repeatedly, he had said that it is not his intention to abolish slavery. He would respect slavery in those states where it existed. He even said he would honor the Fugitive Slave Act, which was hated by Northerners. He would honor the Fugitive Slave Act, but the Southerners just did not believe him. They didn't believe. We talk about echo chambers. They were in their own little echo chamber back then as well. They were convinced he was essentially the Antichrist, and that as soon as he took office, he would abolish slavery. And what Lincoln didn't really appreciate is, for Southerners, that was an existential threat. To abolish slavery overnight, you eliminate the wealth of the Southern planter. You eliminate this Southern culture that had grown up over the prior century and a half. I mean, we're talking about Southern planters who literally called themselves the chivalry, and whose favorite books were books about knights, romances by Sir Walter Scott, and they even had rings tournaments where they would dress up as their favorite knight and go racing down a track to spear, not each other, but to spear rings hanging from wherever. This being sort of a test of their horseback skills and so forth. But this was like right out of the Arthurian knight sagas of Sir Walter Scott and others. And they just, Lincoln didn't get it. He didn't get that this was this world, and that they were afraid he was going to literally destroy all their capital and their culture overnight. And that kind of, recognizing that he did not really get it was something that I found very interesting.
Yeah, and do you want to talk about what's up with Buchanan?
What's up? Well, Buchanan. So here's Lincoln. He decides he's going to keep quiet, relatively quiet. I mean, he still tried to seed the clouds with his views on what was really happening through friendly newspaper editors, through friendly politicians, and so forth. So there was basically a vacuum on that side. There was also a vacuum in Washington with President Buchanan because he was a completely passive and inept, which is strange because his prior political career was stellar. Becomes president. As the national crisis evolves, he realizes this is bad. The one thing Buchanan wanted was to get out of his administration with no war starting on his tenure. And he proceeded, in terms of his administration, to hew to that line. So suddenly you have not just Lincoln being, quiet about the whole process. You have Buchanan. And Buchanan actually he gives his final or his penultimate speech to Congress. He essentially says, I give up. I can't do it. It's not up to me. I can do nothing. It's up to Congress. Now, we know how effective Congress is at getting anything done. But that's what he said. He just basically gave it up. So America was sliding toward absolute disaster with nobody essentially at the helm who was taking full command. Add to that, in Charleston Harbor by now, Fort Sumter and the American garrison there, just 75 men, was under the command of this stalwart guy, Major Robert Anderson, who had been given no orders about what to do. one initial order saying, "You are authorized to fight to the last extremity," and then silence. Then silence from Washington. And as the nation is just sliding toward this catastrophe. I love it. Actually, I have to tell you that as a writer and a former journalist, there are two of me. There's this part, this angel that sits on my shoulder and is the good angel and says, you know, this is really tragic. This is really sad. This moves me unbelievably. Then there's this angel over here. This is the bad angel. The bad angel who says, this is great stuff.
Did you feel that way when you read about Ruffin and you want?
Oh, yes. I mean, that's why he's in the book. I mean, Edmund Ruffin and Senator James Henry Hammond. They're two characters who are very, very important in this whole secession saga, but they have tended to be overlooked by writers of this period, mainly because the whole story of the start of the Civil War has tended to be given short shrift. As one guy I was talking to in the course of my research, he said, nobody wants to read about this. We all want to read about the good stuff. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He said, no, you know, Gettysburg, Antietam, you know, Bull Run. So, why did I start off on that?
The interesting bad guys.
Yeah, bad guys.
Hammond and
Okay, so just as an example, I mean, Senator James Henry Hammond was a prominent planter in Charleston. He was a very important element of the so-called pro-slavery movement, by which Southern planters managed to persuade themselves in the course of the 19th century that slavery was in fact a very good thing for society. It was a net positive, not just for the white enslavers, but also for the enslaved blacks. This was the best of all worlds because, you know, they were the enslaved were cared for, they were, you know, given meals, they were given housing, they were insulated from the ups and downs of the economy, and Southerners came to believe this in a very powerful way. So he was one of the foremost proponents of that. He was also an awful man. His slaves his enslaved blacks were dying at an astonishing rate, and he couldn't figure it out. He left a very detailed diary, by the way, which makes very interesting reading. At one point, he confesses to having a sexual dalliance with 4 of his nieces at once. He was going in my book. That's what I can tell you. And then there's Edmund Ruffin, who plays a very interesting role. He was a Virginian, actually, who got fed up with Virginia dragging its feet in terms of secession, and sort of through his loyalty with South Carolina, and also made it his mission to go throughout the South trying to make secession happen. He was an awful character, too. You'll come across him at the end of the book. But he was, you know, just hated. The Yankees hated the North. He just was absolutely bloodthirsty. He could perceive. He's one of the few people from that era. One thing that I was really startled by was people did not recognize what was really happening in terms of the potential for a catastrophic war. They recognized that the nation was about to, you know, be torn asunder, but even Southerners, even secessionists, did not think that any war that would result would be any big deal. The expression of the era was that any violent conflict that resulted from this whole secession thing would yield only enough blood to fill a lady's thimble. And in fact, one senator took it a step further and said he vowed in Congress that he would eat the bodies of anybody killed in such a conflict, because there would be no bodies. That's why he made that vow. And so there you have this other element of it. Nobody thought there was going to be a crisis. You know, one of the things that I had 2 takeaways from my research on this book. One was that when people start talking crazy, take them seriously. And the other is that the inconceivable is always conceivable by someone. So anyway.
You know, as I was reading this, it seems like every other page there's an opportunity for someone or somehow something to stop the war. I kept thinking, well, mail would have been, the mail running on time would be nice, and people talking to each other would have been nice, people not talking about each other. Do you see in our historic moments now?
Well, can I just address
You
that?
want to go, but you want to go back.
Yeah, I
don't
want to
you?
go back to that.
Because past is present, but
How old are you? Are you 5?
so young.
What was the first part of your question? You were talking. You were.
Ways that the war could have
Okay,
been.
so that's one of the things that really appeals to me, because about telling stories from history, and that is that we know everything now that happened. But what my goal is that when you read one of my books, you fall into the story deeply enough that when each of these things come up, you tell yourself, oh, this can't be happening.
Right.
This is not. No, this could not possibly have happened, as it marches toward this debacle. It's one of the things when I read, one of my favorite nonfiction books is The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman, about the start of World War I. And I've read that several times, and each time I read it, I find myself hoping that World War I will not happen this time. Same feeling when I read Walter Lord's, I've read this a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, Walter Lord's book about the Titanic, A Night to Remember. I have the same feeling. Oh, the Titanic's not going to sink. It can't sink, not this time, and sure enough, it sinks. The beauty of reading is that if you tell a story properly, readers will so fall into the story that they will suspend their knowledge of what actually happened. When I was in Chicago after the publication of Devil in the White City, a woman got up after I gave a talk at the Chicago Club, and I swear she was near tears, and she said, when I finished this book, I didn't want to come back. And it's like, that's exactly what I want. This is my favorite reaction to any of my books. Now, I didn't particularly want to know where she was from, but the other, if I can digress, digressions are my thing also. Rabbit holes are my specialty. After that book came out, the launch of Devil in the White City was, of course, in New York. Publishers being publishers, was in New York, and afterwards, took questions. These two young women got up, very well groomed, no issues whatsoever, got up, and one said, we just wanted to tell you that we are descendants of the serial killer, Holmes or Mudgett, whichever name you want to use. And I was, okay, good. And what really scared the hell out of me was that they were both corporate lawyers, And then, but they said the most interesting thing. They said, we just want to thank you for telling this story about our black sheep, this ancestor. And I'm thinking, black sheep, that's an understatement. Well, we just want to tell you about the, and then one of the women said, we are having a family reunion. Absolute gospel truth. We are having a family reunion this weekend in the Hudson Valley. And I'm thinking to myself, it's got to be Tarrytown, it's got to be Sleepy Hollow, something like this. and I did not say this.
Did you ask them what you should bring?
And they asked me if I wanted to come. And I'm like, nah, I'm having lunch with Charlie Matz and up at Singson. But I declined. I didn't go to this family reunion, but I just love that reaction. Anyway, back to.
I was going to ask a question, but I got a 10-minute warning from Peyton, so I don't want to. And someone might want to ask this question. So Peyton, was that a 10-minute warning? Did I? Okay, yeah. That was like 5 minutes ago too.
Ask away. Yeah.
Or I could ask it. Okay. Oh yes. And here's this awkward moment where we're waiting. How are you doing?
If you feel you have a good booming voice, you can just get up and ask.
Yeah, I do have a teacher voice.
Go ahead.
I'm curious to know, what was your motivation for swearing off of writing about the Civil War? Like, was there something beyond, oh, there's already 60,000 books about it? You said for a long time you swore off of writing about it.
Yeah.
What was your motivation throughout the years for that?
Why did I not want to write about it? Well, my main feeling was, first of all, it was written about so often, but my main feeling also was I didn't need the grief. You know, when you write about something like the Civil War, there's so many experts out there. My late friend Tony Horwitz did a book called Confederates in the Attic. I don't know how many of you read that book, but he told me how crazy his stops on his book tours were. Like in one stop, a woman showed up with a live Civil War era cannon. And that stuck in my head for a long time. but I overcame that, and you know, and actually I have to say the reception to this book has surprised me. People have just been so generous, and so, even in Charleston, you know, when I had a huge 1,500 person event, and afterwards one woman came up to me and said, you know, would you make this out to my great-great-great-grandfather who signed the secession ordinance for South Carolina? And I said, you know, I'm going to balk on that one, but I will gladly sign the book. She said, that's fine. Then another person came up and said, well, my great-great-great, this was a Confederate general who fought at such and such, such and such. I did sign that because, you know, they did what they had to do or felt they had to do. But the war is not over in Charleston. It is not over. It is the War of Northern Aggression, or more recently, Lincoln's War. So, yeah. Anyway. I hope that answered your question.
We have another question from the audience.
I was interested in how you paced this book. I have to admit that I entered it knowing that you would be here and I wanted to read your latest book. I'm not interested in the topic, or I wasn't. I've been compulsive about trying to figure out how you structured everything from that receipt to the background information of what kind of soil the guy came up with and how it worked, and the mud. And I'm glad to hear about it's kind of like this. You're bringing everything into that point, but you're playing a lot of lines all the way through. I mean, we're back and forth. How did you decide on that structure? It's unbelievable. I find myself resenting people who talk to me when I'm reading the book.
What a great question.
But
she is in it.
But did you like the ending? Oh, okay. So I am so.
There is a war.
I'm so glad you asked that. Well, not that you asked that question, but I'm so glad to hear your thinking that it is exactly what I'm trying to achieve with my books, in trying to painstakingly keep things, first of all, keep things in chronological order. That is a very powerful tool. I think it's the single most powerful tool in storytelling. Because if you keep things in chronological order, a lot of your problems are solved in terms of narrative. You just adhere to that absolutely. You can't waver, because you'll throw people off. So that's a very important element. But you did something very interesting when you were telling the story. You went like this, everything geared toward that one point, right? I go like this, everything geared toward that one point. To me, it's an ascent. But it's the same concept. That was very excellent.
Oh my gosh.
Who's up?
So you said you have a common thread, which is suspense, when you pick a story to tell. And I have a question if you have an overall mission, so to speak. I think every vocation can have a mission. And is it related to this skepticism of the simplistic historical hero?
Yeah, I don't approach my books with a sense of mission, other than what I said earlier about that. My hope is that people will descend into my books and not emerge until they have finished, and then emerge with a sense of having lived perhaps briefly in the past. That's my entire goal. I have no other mission, no other agenda than to tell the best story I possibly can. So. I'm disappointed, though, because nobody asked me the question that you weren't supposed to ask me. Which was,
Do you want to answer it?
I am going to answer that question, which is, what am I working on now? And I will never tell anybody what I'm working on now, and I will tell you why I will never tell anybody what I'm working on. Because if I told you, I'm a terrible oral pitcher, I would die in Hollywood. If I told you what I was working on, you would all look at me with this like, oh, or worse, okay. And the ultimate thing, though, that made me convinced that I would never, ever do this again, I was at a family reunion on Long Island with my sisters and in-laws and so forth, and my elder sister, who had a tendency to be a little bit bossy even now, came up to me, and we'd all had some beers, and she came up to me, and she wanted, I was working on Thunderstruck at the time, about Marconi and England's second most famous killer, and she just started badgering me. She said, just tell me what you're working on. I said, no, I don't like to talk about things. She said, tell me, just tell me. And so I thought, well, okay, this is family, it's a family reunion, this is not going to be anything. So I told her what the book was about, and she goes, oh, I wouldn't read that. 4 years, that was rattling around in my head. Like a .22 caliber bullet from The Sopranos, it's just like, oh my God. Anyway, thank you.
So,
Thank you.
whatever Erik Larson is working on, we want him to come back to the Mississippi Book Festival. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much.